In Excel 2010, data validation can be used to help prevent invalid data. It's good for consistency and for accuracy. In this video, we'll create 3 data validation rules. One for the guest name, so that only text can be input. One for the check-in date and the check-out date. And we'll also create a drop-down list for the Chalet, which will use the list that's in the I column. So let's get started and put in the data validation for the guest name. So I'm going to click into the cell that I'd like to put the data validation. And on the Data tab, over to the right, I'm going to click on Data Validation. From here, I'm going to click on the drop-down arrow for any value. And for the first data validation, I'm going to do a custom data validation. And I'll use a formula called isText. So I want to make sure that text is typed into this cell, and it is the D3 cell. Up at the top, I have 2 other tabs. So once I've got the setting for my data validation, I can go and click on the input message, and I could put in a message that when that cell is active, a message will appear. So I'll put in a title for this one and an input message. The Error Alert tab up at the top will allow me to create another message if somebody does not follow the data validation rule. So I am going to keep it as stop so they can't type in anything that's not text, and I'll type in a title and an error message. Once I've got the data validation tabs complete, I would click on OK. And since I'm in that cell, I will have the validation message show up. If I click away from the cell, it goes away. So let's test this out. Perhaps I think I'm in the check-in date field, so I'm going to type in a check-in date. And when I hit enter, I'll get the error message that I typed in the dialog box. So must enter text for the guest name. So I could retry, and then I could type in a guest name. And when I hit enter, it will allow that. So for right now, I'm going to go back into that cell and just delete the text that I've put in there by pressing delete on the keyboard. That will not delete the data validation. Next, let's do the check-in date and check-out date. Perhaps I'm only going to be taking dates for this next year, starting September 1st of 2013. With the cells selected for the check-in date and check-out date, I'm going to go back to the data validation, go back to the Settings tab, and choose Date. And for the start date, I'll put 9/1/13. And for the end date, I'll do 8/31/14. I'm not going to put an input message for this one, but I might want to put an error alert, just in case an invalid date is input. Once I'm done, I would click on OK. And to test this out, for the check-in date, let's see what happens if I put in a date that's not part of the data validation. I'll get my error message saying it's an invalid date, and it will tell me the dates that are acceptable for the data validation. I'm going to go ahead and cancel. And now let's go ahead and talk about the Chalet. With the Chalet, I'd like to pick from a drop-down list. It's handy if you have a list already set up, which I do in the I column. And when I'm done, I might want to hide that column. So I'm going to select from C5 down to C9 and go back to Data Validation, back to the Settings tab, and choose List from the drop-down. The source for this is I3 down to I7. And I could put an input message, but I'm going to leave that empty, and an error alert as well. So I might want to make sure they pick from the list. And when I'm done, I would click on OK. And now I'll be able to see that each of those cells that I had selected has a drop-down arrow, and I could pick from the list. I cannot type in something that is not part of the list. So if I tried to type in Apple, I would get the invalid data message and telling me that I must pick a Chalet from the list. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel. And I'll press delete to get rid of the cherry Chalet. And again, by pressing delete, it will just delete the contents of the cell, but the data validation will still be there. I can hide the I column now. And if I wanted to get rid of a data validation, so maybe for guest name, I'd like to remove that data validation, I'm in that cell. I'm going to go up to the data validation and clear all. And OK. And now I could type text or numbers into that cell. And those are some examples of data validation in Excel 2010.